The more I was in these rooms with these people, the first thing out of their mouths would be like, well, yeah, we have this overcriminalization problem, and we also have this mass incarceration problem, and they're related. It's like, no, they're not. The same 10, 12 offenses have accounted for like 90% of all prisoners for the last 50 years. What are you talking about? The sort of main goal of a lot of people within that movement was actually just decarceration for its own sake, and that was something I just didn't agree with.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. Here I am in New York City. Our friends at the Manhattan Institute are kind enough to let us borrow their studio for an afternoon to record some episodes. And sitting with me is one of their top scholars, the Nick O'Neill Fellow and Head of Research for Policing and Public Safety, Rafael Mangual. Rafael, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Here I am on your home turf, and this is literally your home turf. You know, your city, and obviously this great institution, which, like Heritage and some others, really does lead the way when it comes to research. And I would say, and my colleagues at Heritage who work on policing and public safety would say that Manhattan's work on those issues, and your work in particular, is really important. And we're going to get into that. But you're from New York.
I am.
I'm from the Gulf Coast. And what you might not yet know about Southerners is that we can't figure out if we can trust someone until we ask them their story.
Okay.
You and I were visiting for a few minutes, so I already knew I can trust you.
Good.
Yeah,
Good.
you've hit that bar.
I've got a trustworthy.
You're probably now thinking, there's no way I can trust this guy. No, but the point is, one of the things we try to do on this show is not just talk about important policy, which we're going to do with you because you're one of the luminaries of our movement, but explain to people, especially younger members of the audience who might be thinking, how can I make a difference for this great country? How you got into doing what you're doing. And now I know you're a baseball fan, maybe even player, mixed martial arts guy, so I have to be on my best behavior.
Mixed martial arts fan, but I promise you I'm not dangerous at all.
Okay, sounds good.
So, really kind of my story is just one based in following my passion. I did not know I cared very deeply about these issues until I was confronted with them for the first time. And that story kind of begins late in life in college. I remember sitting in a second-year sociology class, and basically our professor would have a guest speaker once a week. So we had a Monday, Wednesday class, and I think it was Wednesdays, the first half hour or so would be a guest speaker. And one day this guest speaker was an ex-con, a guy who had just gotten out of prison, and he gave this speech, and it was basically just a diatribe. Just, the police are racist, the criminal justice system is racist, I was railroaded, I'm innocent. And, New Yorkers, like Southerners, also don't really trust people inherently.
It's a great commonality.
Yes. And I just remember sitting there and listening and wanting to connect with this guy, but I just viscerally could not get on his page. And I think part of that was a function of growing up around people who had been involved in the criminal justice system, who had been arrested and incarcerated, family, friends. Also, I am the son of a New York City cop. So, I grew up around cops. I grew up with a cop. My experiences were generally pretty positive. So I remember at the end of the talk feeling like I wanted to speak up, but not knowing what to say. I didn't have any real base of knowledge on which I could push back and dig into. And so I went home that day and I got on Ask Jeeves, which was the search engine of choice.
That's a blast from the past. A lot of the audience won't even know what that is.
Yeah, that was before Google was Google. It was Ask Jeeves for me, Yahoo maybe occasionally. And I came across the work of the Manhattan Institute. Went down a rabbit hole over the next couple of years of just, conservative thought and particularly thought on these issues. And by the end of college, I pretty much knew that I wanted to do this for a living, which is strange. I mean, you ask most kids in college what they want to do, and I think maybe 1 out of a million will say, I want to work for a think tank. But I started looking at the resumes of people in this space who I respected. And, everyone who was really good at their job either had a PhD in economics or a law degree. And I did not want to go get a PhD in economics, so I went to law school and got very, very lucky insofar as I was able to land a job here right out.
And you're not only the leader of that work here, along with some great colleagues of yours, but as I mentioned, for the entire movement. And so swerving from your story, which is obviously very relevant to the policy work that you do, to that policy work, how would you summarize how would you assess the situation of policing and public safety in the United States in 2023?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big question. It is policing and public safety in the United States, generally is one of the most misunderstood phenomenon or collections of phenomenon that you have. I mean, everyone has an opinion on it. Very few people really understand what the intricacies are and what they look like, what the data say. So you have a couple of different stories you can tell. I mean, the United States is an advanced society. We function very well. And I think public safety and our public safety story is a big part of that. I mean, you look at cities like New York and, for the most part, although things are certainly moving in the wrong direction these days, it's a functioning city. And that can't happen without the provision of public safety that comes from institutions of law enforcement, particularly police. And so, from that perspective, you can say that, in the United States, we're kind of a global leader on that front. I mean, there's certain parts of the world in which, public safety is not something that you can take for granted, at least at the level that many of us can here. At the same time, a lot of our history has been marred by, really high levels of crime. And relative to other parts of the world, particularly Western European democracies, we have a lot of serious violence. And that violence concentrates in really small pockets of our country where people who are not as fortunate as you and I are kind of stuck living with unbelievably high levels of violence. And that has gotten worse, I think, over the last decade plus. And one of the reasons for that has to do with that misunderstanding about what the role of criminal justice is, how it actually works. And I think part of America's story right now, we're in a chapter that is really based on this idea that misunderstanding of these institutions has led to an erosion of those institutions, an erosion of their power, an erosion of their ability to provide one of the most important public benefits that any government can provide, which is public safety. And, we're seeing crime numbers move in the wrong direction. We're seeing indications of disorder move in the wrong direction. And I think ultimately what we're going to see if we don't get that problem fixed quickly is we're going to see cities in general start moving in the wrong direction, because crime does thrive in and around cities. And cities, I think, are also incredibly important to just America's structure. They're centers of economic dynamism. I don't think we could be the USA that we are today without big, functioning, popular cities that people want to come to, that thought leaders come and exchange ideas in. And so, we're kind of in the middle of a pendulum swing back in the opposite direction that we were swinging in the 1990s, where people were kind of fed up with where crime was and, decided that, okay, it's time to get tough. It's time to invest in policing. It's time to, invest in our criminal justice system more broadly. You saw things like 3 strikes regimes and truth in sentencing regimes and mandatory minimums. The appetite for those sorts of interventions, I think, has eroded with public safety, such that we're kind of victims of our own success, right? I mean, we had this massive decline in serious crime over the course of the 90s and early aughts. And, as that happened, people became less and less comfortable with having a robust enforcement mechanism in place. And, there is a very effective public awareness campaign, I guess you could call it, a public relations campaign against these institutions of law enforcement, rooted in this idea that these institutions are draconian, that they're racially oppressive. And that's a powerful narrative. It's the narrative that I was confronted with as a young college student. And I watched, about 200 people in that lecture hall, and I watched people's head nod. And it was a very compelling story. Everyone wants to be part of something important, I think. And what more important thing can you be a part of other than a fight against oppression, a fight against racism? And so, if you become convinced that these institutions are sort of centers of that problem, then it makes sense that you would fight back against them. And so, part of the work that I do is sort of identifying where the gap is between the rhetoric about criminal justice in the U.S. and what the reality is, and showing people that eroding these systems for the sake of just doing that as if that's a public policy good unto itself is incredibly misguided, and so misguided in a bunch of different ways. But one of the most ironic ways it's misguided is that it actually hurts the very communities that a lot of reformers say they're out to help.
It's an excellent summary, and I appreciated that. And I've worked some in this policy space, which we were talking about off camera. We'll come back to that in ways that I think will be helpful for our audience. But speaking of the audience, I know they had to appreciate that summary because there's so much there. And what I mean by that is, just as kind of a policy generalist, that as policing and public safety go, so goes the republic, right? Because all aspects of life,
right.
by definition, your dad, the law enforcement officer, would probably say this, right? And that's good and bad, right? And so I presume that's what motivated you to write this wonderful book, Criminal Injustice. And this is recent, out in 2022, right? And so tell us about the motivation, but also highlights, especially for people who say, man, Rafael's really intrigued me. I want to learn more.
Yeah. So, the motivation for the book was really just I had kind of reached a point where doing this work, working in this space for so many years, I had just been confronted with story after story after story of some heinous crime. A child gets hit with a stray bullet, or a single mom is murdered in broad daylight. And it's like every time you see one of these stories and there's an arrest, you look into the history of the person arrested, and it's like they've got 15 prior arrests. They were out on probation. They were out on parole. They were awaiting trial. And it's like you have this huge problem that's been getting worse since 2015, right? This big spike in murders in 2015 and 16, kind of leveled off in 2017 and 18, and then huge spike in 2020. And that problem is driven by repeat offenders, by people whom the system has every reason and legal authority to apprehend and detain, and through a political choice is not doing that. And that political choice has consequences for communities that I really care about. I mean, communities that I came from, communities that I have family in. My wife is from the west side of Chicago. I have family on the west side of Chicago. It is not a safe place to live. It's not the kind of place, that I would want to raise my family if I had the choice. And, one of the things that I've learned living in some of these communities is that I'm a beneficiary of an incredible privilege. There's so much talk about privilege in this country, right? But one of the privileges that goes unnoticed is the privilege to be able to live in safety. I mean, crime is something that we talk about in very national terms, which is another kind of motivating factor, was sort of pushing back on this tendency, this colloquialism to talk about America's crime problem or New York's crime problem. I'm guilty of it, myself, and it's just easier to do. It helps people wrap their head around the problem. But crime's a very hyper-local phenomenon, and the distribution of safety is so incredibly uneven. I mean, just to kind of put it in perspective, if you look at the 10 most dangerous neighborhoods in Chicago, collectively they had a homicide rate in 2019 of over 61 per 100,000. That year, the national homicide rate was about 5 per 100,000. If you took the 10 safest neighborhoods in Chicago, it was about 2 per 100,000. And if you pick out some of the most dangerous neighborhoods within that group of 10, you get places like West Garfield Park, which had a homicide rate of 131 per 100,000. So I just think about what it is like. I mean, just to put that in perspective, that is more dangerous than the battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq. Right. And so, if you think about it from this perspective, like say you're a mom in 2002, sending your 18-year-old son off to the Marines, knowing that there's a good chance that he's going to end up in Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, it is only natural for you to be incredibly fearful to make that decision. And that fear is going to be based on the likelihood that they may not be able to come home, let alone in one piece. Now, imagine what it's like living in a neighborhood where you have to send your son to school every single day in a place with a homicide rate that's significantly higher than those battlefields, and what the psychological toll of that is. And so having understood that, having experienced crime, having known crime, serious crime victims, and just been bombarded with these stories by virtue of the work that I do, I just kind of got fed up and wanted to put something out there that just pushed back on the sort of two policy agenda items that I saw as likeliest to exacerbate the risks of the sort of problems I think we all want to avoid, and that's decarceration and depolicing. And the idea that we have far too many people in prisons, so much so that we should release half of them, and that this won't have any public policy consequences, that this won't have any public safety consequences, is just silly to me. And I wanted to get out there and make that case, and this book was the byproduct of that.
Well, I'm really grateful for the book in a general sense, but also in a particular sense, as you probably know, as someone who is participating in conservative criminal justice reform, which was well-intentioned. I'm sure you would posit that too, and that's what I know to be the case. I got tired of it, just to be kind of blunt, a few years ago when I thought that really well-intentioned reform got hijacked. And I won't mention names, of course, but it got hijacked by people who simply wanted to undo policing and public safety. And the end, which was always human flourishing, and justice, which go hand in hand, became instead how quickly we can reduce the number of incarcerated people. Yeah. And that's when I realized as a conservative, no adjective in front of that, just a conservative, that didn't make sense, because the heart of conservatism, or one of the parts of the heart of conservatism, is understanding the rule of law. And so I have kind of that long-winded lead up to the question for you to know. You can say whatever you want to say about conservative criminal justice reform. You wouldn't offend me anyway. But I think we're at a point, at an inflection point in the center-right movement in this country, where we realize, even if we posit that was well-intentioned, that is now concluded, that we need to be focused on what you're doing.
Yeah, I think the crime problem has to absolutely take priority over, some of the agenda items that, were at the top of the list of things that the conservative reform movement wanted to achieve. And I got to say, when I started at the Manhattan Institute, that was my focus, was conservative criminal justice reform. I started writing about overcriminalization, and particularly, legislative and regulatory overcrim. And I remember going to these meetings and conferences, and you'd be on a panel and someone would, we're here to talk about the fact that, at the national level, there was something at the time like 350 to 400,000 criminally enforceable rules and regulations. I remember thinking, this is ridiculous, right? I can't think of 300 things that you should go to jail for, let alone 300,000. I mean,
it's really hard. I mean, just if you stop and think about that, it just seems impossible.
It's crazy. I mean, I remember being just confounded by the fact that the ABA had actually tried to count all the criminal laws on the books and couldn't, because the criminal law was proliferating so quickly that they actually couldn't keep up. And so that was a problem that, I thought was a serious one that deserved attention. But the more I was in these rooms with these people, the first thing out of their mouths would be like, well, yeah, we have this overcriminalization problem, and we also have this mass incarceration problem, and they're related. And it's like, no, they're not. The same 10, 12 offenses have accounted for like 90% of all prisoners for the last 50 years. What are you talking about? And I realized, very early on that, the sort of main goal of a lot of people within that movement was actually just decarceration for its own sake. And that was something I just didn't agree with. And so it didn't take very long for me to kind of switch my focus over to sort of traditional law enforcement issues. And a lot of that had to do with the homicide rise that we saw in 2015 and 16. And so I do see that there's hope, certainly among conservatives, that we've identified what the right issue is for our time, what we need to focus on, what requires the most energy. But I do think we have an uphill battle. I mean, the criminal justice reform movement, has just so much momentum. I just wrote a piece for City Journal that should be out soon about this. But I mean, if you just think about the amount of movement that we've seen on criminal justice reform. I mean, we have massive declines in the incarcerated population. We have massive declines in both jails and prisons. We have declines in the number of police officers, declines in arrests, declines in stops and frisks in cities across the all kinds of legislative reforms have been enacted: bail reforms, discovery reforms, juvenile justice reforms, parole reforms, decriminalization efforts. The list goes on and on and on. All kinds of police oversight, federal consent decrees. At no point does it seem to be the case that the left or the reform movement sees a light at the end of the tunnel?
They want to keep going.
Right. So this is really problematic, in part because we still don't even fully understand the effect of all those levers that we've pulled. And yet they want to continue to go more and more and more without seeming to grapple with the fact of the downside risk, which is that, hey, this might actually lower the transaction cost of committing crime and raise the transaction cost of enforcing the law to such a degree that we're going to get more crime. And I think that's exactly what's happening. And so
you think that's a working hypothesis?
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about just let's just box off incarceration, right? You think about what that is supposed to do. People talk about incarceration in light of the sort of four penological lens that it's intended to serve. You have incapacitation, deterrence, retribution, and rehabilitation. But incapacitation, I think, really should be the main focus of our movement here, because rehabilitation, I think it's good to invest in, but we don't really have any clue how to rehabilitate people reliably, let alone how to do that at scale. We have 1.9 million people incarcerated in this country. Retribution, I think it's good for society's sort of desire to punish bad conduct to be satiated, because I don't want to encourage vigilante justice. And, if they don't have faith that the system will do the job, they will take it into their own hands. And that's just not a world I want to live in. Deterrence, there's a decent amount of literature in support of the idea that if you raise the transaction cost of committing crime enough that you can reduce it. And so I do think that's a legitimate end. But incapacitation, I think, is the big thing. Again, when you see these stories of terrible crimes committed by people with, 15, 20, 30 prior arrests who, have active criminal justice statuses, the same question gets asked over and over again. So what were they doing out on the street? And it's like, yes, that is the question, right? And the answer is it's a policy choice. It's a policy choice. And so what we really need to do is just kind of understand that when you cut the prison population by 25% over a short period of time, that's going to have consequences if, in fact, the people who are in prison today are likely to commit crimes. And we know that they are because we have data telling us that. The recidivism numbers in this country are atrocious. About 80 to 83% of people who get released from state prison will go on to be rearrested at least once over 10 years. On average, they'll get rearrested 5 times. A good number of them will be rearrested for serious violent crimes. And that's really just a drop in the bucket of the total crime that population commits, because what do we know? Most crime doesn't get reported, and most crime that gets reported doesn't get solved. That's just a reality. The clearance rates for the violent index offenses that are tracked by the FBI hovers around 47%. For the property index offenses, it's about 17 to 18%. So you have this massive amount of criminal conduct that goes unanswered for, right? You have this huge population of prisoners that continues to get arrested post-release. We can look at their criminal histories pre-incarceration, and we know that this was a pre-existing pattern. The typical state prisoner has about 10 prior arrests and 5 prior convictions. So these are not people who've been denied second chances, which is what the sort of central narrative is, right? We have Second Chance Month in the United States, which always makes me laugh because it's like, who is it that's been denied second? I mean,
it's not a large number.
No, it's not. My colleague Heather McDonald a few years ago had this wonderful line where she said, a multi-year sentence in prison is akin to a lifetime achievement award for persistence in criminal offending, because it's just so
I think
hard.
only Heather could come up with that.
Oh, yeah. No, she's fantastic. And I think she's exactly right. And that's exactly what the data show. And so, when you have people who have dedicated massive amounts of money and massive amounts of effort to reducing that number, the number of people incarcerated, you are increasing the risk of crime committed by a population that has already shown themselves unwilling to play by society's rules. And, I wanted to highlight that with this book, but I also wanted to make the point that, again, that risk, not going to be evenly distributed, right? You could release everyone from prison today, and Greenwich, Connecticut, probably not going to get all that unsafe, right? I mean, the really safe enclaves will likely stay that way because they're safe by virtue of, the fact that they just have really law-abiding people, right? Their residents are pro-social in their dispositions, and that's that. But the small pockets where crime concentrates, where you have the vast majority of residents just want to go about their lives. They're good law-abiding people. In the highest crime neighborhood you could pick out, the majority of people are good law-abiding people. Yes, and they deserve safety too. And it's like it's like as if you're walking into a casino. You walk up to the roulette table. You say, give me $10,000 in chips, but you're playing with the 401k of the guy next to you. Like, that's just one of the most frustrating things about it. It's like we're just rolling the dice with the lives of people who live in places that I suspect a lot of people in the reform movement would never dare send their kids to school in or walk through at night. Yeah,
it's not unlike the opponents to school choice, right? As long as they get to send their kids to the schools of their choice, who need school choice, and some of the same folks. But I want to key in on something that you mentioned regarding rehabilitation for 2 reasons. The first is I have been part of some of the efforts to look at or to perform academic studies that look at the data on that in the early and mid phases of the so-called conservative criminal justice reform movement. And so I'm interested in it. But the second is to get your assessment of this statement. It seems at best those studies would show mixed results.
Yes.
And if we wanted to be pessimistic, which I think neither of us do, especially for conservative friends in the movement still interested in criminal justice reform, we would say there's no reason whatsoever to think that that investment in rehabilitation has done anything.
Yeah. No, I think it's one of the most disappointing literatures.
It is disappointing.
If you read it, because it's something that we want to have an answer to. No one wants to write people off as just, incorrigible and that's it. There's no saving them. But, there is a point at which society has to draw a line and say, okay, enough. You've had your chances. We don't have confidence that we can fix you. And as a result of that, we're not going to continue to let you victimize members of your community. But yeah, when I read the literature on rehabilitation, what I see is that at best you have mixed results, right? And I think that's exactly the right way to put it. I would say the overwhelming weight of the literature leans in the direction that we don't have a reliable formula for rehabilitating the type of people that tend to populate our prisons and jails. There are some programs that do show promise. I think what you see when you look at the assessments of those programs is that the observation periods are relatively short. So we don't know whether there's a regression back toward the mean over time. So maybe over 12 months or 24 months, you might see some positive results, but we still don't know what's going to happen at 48 months or 10 years, right? And the other thing you're going to see is that they're very intensive in terms of resources, right? They require a lot of one-on-one therapy, small group therapy. This is like things that are happening multiple times a week or at least once a week. That's really hard to scale up when you're talking about 1.9 million people incarcerated in the United States, let alone however many people are in the system as parolees or probationers. And so that's a massive challenge, right? I mean, as I mentioned in the book, the CDC predicts over the next 10 years that we're going to have about a 25% shortfall of qualified mental health workers across different areas of mental health work. And so the idea that there even exists a population of qualified mental health workers that could implement programs, assuming that we had them across a population of prisoners that big that would be willing to work in those settings for that kind of pay, I think is another really big hurdle to the idea that we have this problem solved. And so the other thing I think you see is a lot of selection bias. I mean, so a lot of these studies, as I'm sure you know, sometimes people have to opt into the program. So you're already dealing with a subset of prisoners who are, maybe more amenable to change by virtue of the fact that they cared enough to apply, right? Some programs exclude certain types of offenders. So they may exclude lifers. They may exclude, people who have been convicted of violent sex offenses or whatever. And so, again, that doesn't necessarily tell you that this is scalable across the whole population. And again, you see these really short observation periods. And so, when you extend the observation period, as some of these studies have done, you tend to see regression back toward the mean, which, again, is not something I take pleasure in noting. It sucks. I wish there were an answer, but
nor do I. And I'd say that because I still have good friends who are working on criminal justice reform. They're certainly moving the direction that you are because they're smart people. But so I don't say it to be gratuitous, but just to say, as a bit of a social scientist, as a policy person, when I started asking those questions about those rehabilitation efforts, all of them well-intentioned.
Sure.
Not just for the people in them, but for the sake of looking for that rehabilitation program that could be scaled, to your point, I never once got a satisfactory answer, just as an academic. And I'm just sitting there thinking, man, if this were in graduate school and this were a student of mine, I simply could not say that you've gotten the results that prove your thesis.
Right.
And I lament that because especially in the United States, the land of redemption, we want rehabilitation to work. The headline is we haven't found a program that can be scaled on the level that it needs to. And that's unfortunate on the human level.
Yeah, it is. And, but I think it points in a direction that, it points to something that we've recognized in a few other contexts. And that is that real change comes from the individual, comes from the inside. Someone has to decide, I'm done. I want to make my life better. And sometimes, the research does seem to show that early intervention of the criminal justice system can actually be that shock to the system. I have personal acquaintances and family members who have been incarcerated who said that did it. But it was early. People have to get. Sometimes it's the birth of a child that there's fascinating literature showing that there's a good bit of desistance from criminal activity from people who have records and active statuses after their child is born.
Yet another good reason to reject the population bomb thesis.
That's right. There's literature showing actually that incarceration can reduce crime by actually taking people away from their criminal network. So, this is actually one wrinkle in the reform movement because a lot of reformers want to keep people incarcerated closer to home so that it can make it easier for their family to visit them, et cetera, which is an understandable goal to pursue. But there's some papers out there showing that actually the further away from home you get incarcerated, the less likely you are to recidivate because your criminal ties tend to erode more quickly. And you're also not as guaranteed to go back to your home neighborhood, and you may start your life somewhere else where your surroundings are a bit more conducive to a positive outcome. And so, the main message I wanted to get across with the book is that, these topics are really complicated. The idea that someone just has all the answers is nonsense. And because it's complicated, I think we have to be very sober and careful about what levers we pull, particularly when we're talking about levers that might exacerbate the risk of criminal offending, because, again, that's not a risk that we bear evenly. And I think we owe it to people who don't have the good fortune to live in really safe places, right? I mean, I talk about this in the book, but when my wife and I got pregnant with our son, we were living in East Harlem, and it was a great building, but it was a terrible neighborhood, and there was a lot of crime and a lot of disorder. And as soon as we found out we were pregnant, we were like, well, I think it's time to move. And we had the ability to break our lease and pick a safer neighborhood and do that, but across the street in the Douglas houses, people don't have that option. And so, again, it's just that's the message that I really want people to come away with. It's like, these are complicated questions. The idea that we can just cut 50 or, do all these other things that, are really popular, defund the police, that's a simplistic answer to a very complicated question. You should always be suspicious of simplistic answers. And those answers create a risk, an exacerbated risk, that is going to fall on the least advantaged members of our society. And that should matter.
It matters a great deal. So a practical question for you, if you don't mind, applying the lessons from your book and from your research. If you were advising a mayor of, you can pick the city, or a governor, you pick the state, red state, red city, blue city, in between. What are the 2 or 3 policies that you would encourage them to enact, politics aside, that actually cut to the heart of restoring public safety?
Invest in policing. More cops. I mean, the United States across the country, I mean, you pick a major city, very few are sort of operating at the level that they want to be operating at.
I can't think of one. Are there? I mean, in terms of major cities?
No, I really can't think of a major city right now that has not been hit by the recruitment and retention crisis. So invest in policing and don't just throw money at it blindly. Try and figure out a way to recruit highly motivated, high-functioning people who really want to do this job, right? What you don't want to do is what a lot of cities have been forced to do, which is lower standards. Because what's going to happen is the delta between the average cop and the average perp is going to start to go like this, and that's not going to be good for anybody. And it's certainly not going to be good for that institution. And, lots of people who follow this, can tell lots of crazy stories about the corruption in policing in the 1970s and
some horror stories, and some emerging horror stories just in the last few weeks.
Exactly.
And no disrespect to law enforcement officers, the opposite.
Right.
Because we respect them so much, we don't want those standards to go down.
Exactly. But one of the best things that ever happened to policing was the professionalization of it. And so, but that takes investment. You have to make that job attractive, and you have to make it attractive to people who have options. Because right now, people who have options are just not choosing to take that job. And why would they, right? I mean, you're going to be demonized. You're, going to be in legal jeopardy in, possibly unfair situations. And you're not going to get paid very well. So that's number one. Number two is on the incarceration front, you have to draw a line and set a standard as to how much repeated criminal conduct you're willing to tolerate as a society. Whether it's 3 strikes or 5 strikes or 10 strikes, figure out what the right number is, draw that line in the sand and enforce it. And then, the other thing is something that's actually outside of the control of policymakers, and it's the politics part of this. This is in a lot of ways a political problem. The public has to do its part to understand these issues and to inform themselves when they make really important voting decisions for offices like DA, judgeships. That matters. Because the criminal justice system, the laws that you have on the books are only as good as the people tasked with enforcing them and administering them. And so you can have really great cops without a great DA, or with a DA who is actively trying to undermine the mission of the cops, as you have in some parts of this country right now. Those efforts are going to matter less and less, right? If you look at some of the research on the effect of policing on crime, what you'll find is that a good portion of that effect comes through incapacitation, through the fact that when you have more cops, they make more arrests. Those arrests result in the absence of criminal actors from the street, and that absence means a reduction in crime.
Kind of a math problem.
Right. But if you have cops who continue to go out there and make arrests, and then a DA who won't prosecute or a judge who won't hand down a harsh sentence, the efforts of those cops becomes much more muted. And so, those are really the main things. Put a cap on repeated criminal conduct. Draw a line. Say, this is your whatever, 4th felony, 5th felony, whatever the number is, conviction. That's it. You're getting a 10-year sentence enhancement. Or, get people off the street for long enough to give their communities the room that they need to breathe and grow and recover from the criminal conduct that they endured. Because, that's another. We think about crime really in terms of like the offender and the victim. But it just goes so far beyond that. I mean, first off, it goes far beyond the incident, right? It's like, okay, there was a burglary, right? So your family comes home, they find their home ransacked and their possessions gone. It doesn't stop there. It's not, okay, this is the financial amount of what was stolen and what it took to fix whatever was broken. It's the fact that that family may not feel comfortable in that house forever. And in 2 months, it may get to the point where they have to move, and maybe they take a big hit on the house. And just psychologically now, that's a big issue. And then that story goes into the ether in the neighborhood, and that hurts the reputation. So potential buyers maybe don't pick that house. And over time, if that happens over and over again, communities can really, really suffer. So the ripple effects of crime just can get really, really far out there. I mean, there's research showing, for example, that high school students will perform statistically significantly worse on standardized tests if they live within a certain radius of a homicide versus kids in their same class with the same backgrounds who live outside that radius.
That's telling.
Yeah. I mean, again, just think about it. You mentioned, at the beginning of our conversation that public safety is one of those things that society needs to function. And I'm just thinking back to law school. I had a property professor who, said the importance of property law was that it gives us the confidence to go out and participate in the economy, because without property law, we would just all resort to the 12-gauge solution. And someone said, what's the 12-gauge solution? Well, you sit on your porch with a 12-gauge shotgun, you guard all of your belongings because you don't have any confidence that there's a system in place to do that for you. And
it's a vital part of our system.
It is. And so if you live in a place where crime is just a fact of daily life, that has a psychological impact. It impacts the decisions you make about the money you're going to spend, how much time you're going to spend away from your house, whether you go out at night, which streets you go down or don't go down, which schools you send your kid to, which kids you let your kids hang out with. I mean, and it's just, it's a really, really complex problem, and it becomes really harmful and toxic for a neighborhood. And so, yeah, that's why I do what I do.
No, I'm glad you do what you do, and you're very good at explaining it. And I would sit here and talk to you for several hours about it, but I'll ask you one last question, Rafael, and that is kind of the proverbial crystal ball question.
Okay.
How optimistic are you that in this decade, the 2020s, the United States is once again, because we've done this before, going to get it right on policing and public safety?
I'd say it's 50-50. Yeah, I'd say it's 50-50. I mean, look, I think, again, we're in the middle of a pendulum swing back to the left on this issue. And I think that swing has a lot of momentum, and so it's going to take a while to slow that pendulum down, let alone get it moving back in the direction of equilibrium. I do think the reform movement still has a lot of momentum. I think that comes through in the laws that are continuing to be enacted, the policies that are continuing to be proposed, on the lack of backlash. I guess maybe, I don't know if that's the right word, but of a sort of swing back. I mean, we haven't seen a collection of sort of tougher approaches come to fruition yet. I hope, however, that by virtue of the fact that we have this relatively recent history to draw on, that it will take less time for that pendulum to come back, and that it won't swing as far past the point of equilibrium as it did maybe in the 1960s and 70s, that I think created the mess that we saw in the late 70s and 80s and early 90s that we cleaned up over the course of the 1990s and 2000s. So we have that history that we can draw on. It's really up to us. I guess if I, had a gun to my head and had to make a prediction, I would say cities are going to continue to suffer. I think, we've seen a kind of political fracturing of this country where people are sort of collecting themselves and voting with their feet. And so I think actually rather than the cities leading the way as they did in the 1990s, you're going to see some suburban, exurban departments around major metros. Maybe start to sort of get tougher. You'll see some judge elections in more rural parts of the country kind of go in a certain direction, and that will hopefully prompt a movement. But I'm not terribly hopeful in the short run, that's for sure.
Yeah, it does seem to me that if I think about places like Texas or my new home state of Virginia, that's what's happening. The suburban, exurban communities are standing up. But in the middle of them, there's a 90% chance that there is a DA who is not enforcing the law. And my colleagues, Cully Stimson, Zach Smith, have a book coming out. It's not the purpose of making this comment, although it's certainly praiseworthy as your book is on rogue prosecutors. And certainly one of the motivations in my wanting to sit down with you, in addition to just trying to help a friend at a friendly institution out with books, is to show the conservative movement that the chapter of conservative criminal justice reform is concluded. And the new chapter, which you're writing rather literally, is also one that is well-intentioned and focused on human flourishing. And it, in many ways, has to be a return to what we got right for 10 or 15 years. And hopefully the entire movement will follow Manhattan and heritage as we chart that course, always looking for opportunities for rehabilitation, but recognizing that this decade-long experiment has only been that. It's been a well-intentioned one that's been hijacked by the radical left, not just the left, the radical left, and it's time to bring it to an end. So, Rafael Mangual, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to sit with me. We wish you the best with your work, and of course, wish Manhattan the best with everything that y'all do.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for joining this episode of The Kevin Roberts Show. Obviously heavy hitting, but it's something that affects all of us, because if we continue to lose on the issues of policing and public safety, we lose the very basis of what makes America, America. And that is, as our friend Rafael said, protecting the rule of law. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.